Weird things that you can do in Magic the Gathering, Part 7. There are 20 cards that enter the battlefield as copies with subtle changes. What happens when we chain them all together? Our base creature is of course going to be Brothers Yamazaki, which gets bigger when you have more copies of it. First up, we're going to cast Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, which means that the legend rule no longer applies to our permanents. Next in the chain is Phyrexian Metamorph, which makes the copy an artifact in addition to its other types. After the Metamorph, we're going to carry on alphabetically, so up next is the Altered Ego, which enters the battlefield as a copy, except that it has X+1/+1 counters on it. Up next, we're going to cast Copy Artifact, which enters the battlefield as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield, except that it's an enchantment in addition to its other types, which means that our Brothers Yamazaki is now a legendary enchantment artifact creature. Next up is Dax Duplicate, which enters the battlefield as a copy, except that it has Haste and Dethrone. Next up is Estrid's Invocation, which enters the battlefield as a copy of an enchantment you control, except that it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile this enchantment, and if you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Next up in our rules text adventure, we have Evil Twin, which enters the battlefield as a copy of a creature, except that it has blue-black tap. Destroy target creature with the same name as this creature. You might notice that the text box on the left is getting a little bit full. Next up we have Gigantoplasm, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it gives the ability X. This creature has base power and toughness XX. Next up, a relatively new card in Glasspool Mimic, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it's a shapeshifter rogue in addition to its other types. At the halfway point we're going to play Mercurial Pretender, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it has 2 blue, return this creature to its owner's hand. Another shiny new card in Marite of the Frost, which enters the battlefield as a copy, except that it's legendary and snow, and enters with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it, and has Changeling. After Marite, one of my favourite janky creatures, Progenitor Mimic, which enters the battlefield as a copy of a creature, except that it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, if this creature isn't a token, create a token that's a copy of this creature. Next up is Quicksilver Gargantuan, which enters the battlefield as a copy, except that its base power and toughness is 7/7. Next up is Sakashima's Student, which would enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature except that it's a ninja in addition to its other creature types, but it's already a ninja because of Marite. This is where things start to get a little bit weird. Next up is Sakashima the Imposter, which enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature except that its name is Sakashima the Imposter. It's legendary in addition to its other types and has 2 blue, return this creature to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. If you look at the text box now, it is getting ridiculously small. It's also worth noting that because the name is Sakashima the Imposter, it's not actually being buffed by the other Brothers Yamazaki at this point. Next up is Spark Double, which enters the battlefield as a copy except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, but it also removes the legendary status. Next up in the increasingly weird copy stakes is Vesuvan Doppelganger, which enters the battlefield as a copy except it doesn't copy the creature's colour, and it also adds, at the beginning of your upkeep you may have this creature become a copy of target creature, except that it doesn't copy that creature's colour, and it has this ability, which means that the Sakashima the Imposter copy has a mana cost of 2 and red, but is now blue. Next up is Vesuvan Shapeshifter, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may turn this creature face down. After that we have Wall of Stolen Identity, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it's a wall in addition to its other types and also has Defender. And last but by no means least is Phantasmal Image, which enters the battlefield as a copy except that it's an illusion in addition to its other types and has, when this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. And that's it. MTGO is extremely unhappy with us. We've completely destroyed the rules text box on the left, but our original Brothers Yamazaki is now a 42-41, so he's pretty happy.